See that you're born an Italian if you want your life to be great. See that you're born an Italiano and your life will be great.
How about some Donadell?
That's a nice.
Hey there, Paisani, and welcome back to another episode of the Italian American Podcast. We are here at the crossroads of Italian America, the heart of Little Italy, Mulberry and Grand. My name is John Viola. No, it's not. John is on vacation, and I'm in charge. So nice to finally be at the helm. So I want to welcome, as I'm on the helm today, an outstanding guest, a top-of-the-line guest, a top-shelf guest, a golden-crowned, diamond-jeweled star, a true star of a land of stars, of Hollywood and Los Angeles, the great Cavalieri Marianna Gatto, the foundress and directress of the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles. So welcome.
Thank you. It's
to
great
my
to be here.
first solo flight. John is on vacation and has put me in my rightful place at the helm. And we are here to discuss today. You created this fantastic, this fabulous book, The Italian Americans of Los Angeles, a history. Now, we were just saying, before we get into who you are, most of our viewers, I'm sure, know who you are, but for our newer viewers, we can go over that. I just want to say this book is aesthetically stunning, which is very much, you're a very aesthetical person, if that's correct. And I was saying before that I didn't know how to deliver this message to someone who hasn't seen the book. So I think so many of Italian American history books that we have on places, well, we have the category of those small books that are basically photo albums.
Mm-hmm.
They're we learn through pictures, and they have all kinds of old photographs that try to tell the story of a particular place. But this is a heavy book. This has taken you many years. But what I love about this book is that I feel it's in what I call like a new layout, right? So we're in an age now, especially now that we have kids who graduate in college who are born after the year 2000, who've only known a technological age, and they're visual learners, right? And they're used to getting not big chunks of information, but a series of small chunks of information. And I think that the way you've laid out this book is brilliant in that sense, because it's heavy on instructional photographs that teach and tell a story. They're not just images. And it's also, it breaks down the chapters, I think, in a very digestible way that's more conducive to today's younger learners. But with all that being said, I want you to tell us who you are, what you've done, a little bit about the museum for our new viewers, and what brought about this book.
Oh, goodness. Okay, well, my name is Marianna Gatto, and I am the executive director and co-founder, as you mentioned, of the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles, and chronicling the Italians of Los Angeles and Southern California and some other places in the West has been my my vocation, my love, my passion for going on 20 years now. But I've spent probably a good part of my life in public history, meaning history kind of for the masses. And along the way, presenting, like you said, is so important, how the information is presented. And what I wanted to do in creating this book was make something that is both like, very serious historical work, but also something that's accessible, that people would be willing to like pick up, and whether they're reading it line by line or, cover to cover or just more casually, something that is interesting and relatable.
So tell us about the museum.
Okay, so the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles is located in one of the oldest buildings from what was one of LA's Italian neighborhoods. in downtown LA. And we have a permanent exhibition that looks at the history of Italian Americans. And then we also do a number of temporary exhibitions and programs, dozens of programs for, people of all ages every year. We just opened a new original exhibition on Italian American inventors. That's been really popular so far. And we hope you come visit.
I had to ask you about so tell us about this new inventors exhibition that you have.
So it examines about 100 Italian and Italian American inventors, but the emphasis is more on Italian Americans. We kind of give a nod to Italy. The exhibition asks a question: were Italian Americans descendants of this great culture of inventors, the Da Vinci's and how did this come to be? Because we see so much innovation coming out of Italian immigrants who often had very limited education. But this exhibition covers everything from Enrico Fermi and his work on the nuclear reactor to the gentleman who created the radio flyer wagon and Yoo-hoo chocolate beverage and the Big Mac, Jim Delegati, the buffalo chicken wing. I mean, that's more food, but you'll see lots of different, fields, including science and medicine, which is often overlooked. We're usually framed as like this culture of food, but there's Italian American scientists doing incredible things today as well.
You know what's one thing, John and I, we were on a road trip one time with my brother. And I forget where we were. I think we were in the Carolinas, and we saw all these local candy bars. And John loves junk food. John has a fascination with that part of Americana. And I think maybe junk food's an unfair term for it. I would say the stuff that's referred to as junk food. And there's a tremendous amount of Italian Americans who were in the confectionery business who invented candy bars. Like when you talk about the Yoo-hoo, and I don't think most people would think of that.
Yes. Ciccone, for example, created the blow pop, the lollipop with bubble gum inside. So he was, started out in a candy factory sweeping the floors and continued becoming a candy chemist. There are lots of incredible stories.
You had a former guest on the podcast, Severino D'Angelo. He was featured.
Yes, he's one of the inventors in his work in automotive safety patents, that sort of thing.
Now, we were having a little bit of chit chat before we went on air. There's a lot of people out there who want to do the book. Right, we're self-publishing people. No one has embraced self-publishing like Italian Americans have,
because nobody else publishes us. We're marginalized in the publishing community.
Why do you think that is?
Because I think in some ways we're like a gray ethnicity. There's certain subjects in Italian America that are that there's a desire for. I mean, there was a lot of pressure or interest on behalf of, why don't you write a cookbook or write a book about the mob? And we'll publish it. But if you want a more honorable, actual, story of the community, there's less of a desire for that. But going back to what you were saying, self-publishing. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, to go back to the fact that I think that, you make a great point. If you're going to have, a cookbook, a mafia or a mafia cookbook, that's your ticket for a lot of people to pay attention. But how much of that is the fact that Italian Americans don't buy books? Not that it excuses people to put us in those two categories, but we are also not people in the book because we don't, and I constantly promote on here people spending money to buy these books, because if we don't show publishers that we're willing to pay for the product, they're not going to want to invest in projects like yours.
Correct. I agree with you.
What if someone came to you and said, how do I do this? How did you go about it? Because I know from knowing you personally that this was more than a labor of love. This was kind of a vacuum that sucked up a huge part of your life. If I'm right. Time, money, treasure, talent.
Yeah.
First, why don't you tell us the challenges it was to do this book?
Well, I mean, this book was probably like 10 years in the making. When I wrote my first book, which was like just a primer on Italian Americans in Los Angeles, I knew that there was going to be a second one because even back then, I think I misunderstood the publisher's requirements. I think I added an additional 0. It was like 50,000 words, and I had written 500,000 words. So I knew back then that there was going to be another work. But it was really when I met the gentleman who became my editor, and I found somebody who appreciated my vision and was interested in helping execute it. But I would say, like, this book is kind of a culmination of close to 20 years of research, off and on, and documenting a community that there was really little scholarship about. Growing up in Los Angeles, I didn't always understand how I fit into Los Angeles as an Italian American and how I fit into Italian America as an Italo-Angelina or as an Italian from Los Angeles. Because we never learned about Italian Americans in school, especially Italian Americans in Los Angeles. They were never described as part of the city's history, even though they began settling in the region 200 years ago. And then I would look up, I would be reading books about Italian American. There was never a mention of Los Angeles. So just the idea that there could be this tremendous 2-century-long history and that it was never documented and really at risk of being forgotten, that was a big part of my motivation. So that was probably really the impetus for creating this book.
So let me ask you a question. The trajectory of immigration to California on the West Coast for Italians is notably different than it was on the East Coast. Give us a little bit of
in a nutshell.
How what that difference is.
Okay, so Italians began settling in Los Angeles in the 1820s, before there was even a California. California doesn't become a state until the mid 1800s. So they began settling in Los Angeles in the early 1820s. When the region was still
part of Spain at that time.
Still part of Mexico. So Mexico gets its independence from Spain, and then
it's about 1817, 1821?
1823. And so the first Italians began settling in Los Angeles in 1827. And, because Los Angeles at that time is like a Hispanic culture, it's a culture where there's Catholicism, Spanish is a lingua franca, it's an agrarian city. Italians fit in. And many of the earliest Italians, they intermarry with the California community, the Spanish-speaking community, and they achieve success as like ranchers, farmers, fishermen. So that's like their earliest immigration. That also tended to be Northern Italian, because coming to Los Angeles was really no joke at the time. There was no railroad, right? So how'd you get there? Either, covered wagon across the nation, which was an incredible journey, or you had to sail around Cape Horn because there wasn't a Panama Canal. And that was a long and expensive journey. So you really had to want to come to Southern California. But then after, the Panama Canal, after the railroad unites Los Angeles with the rest of the nation, and then also after the unification of Italy and the immigration from the South starts to grow. There's an exodus from the South. Yeah, the Italian South. Thank you. When I say the South, it's just, you see the population of Italians in Los Angeles changing and growing, and mirroring a little bit more of the Italian immigration that we're most familiar with. But you also see a lot of Italian Americans coming to Los Angeles from different parts of the country. They if they didn't come to Los Angeles directly, many times they began in New York or Philly or in New Orleans and just continued working their way westward. So it's an experience that shares certain similarities, I think, with the stories that we receive repeated in New York, New Jersey, Chicago, but there's also certain differences. And there's a lot of things that are responsible for that, including California's climate. That's just one.
So why don't you map out those differences for us?
Well, if you look at Los Angeles compared to New York City, for instance, Los Angeles is huge. Just, there's so much more land. And at that time, especially, you could settle in an enclave where Italians were the majority. Los Angeles once had 7 Italian neighborhoods where, if they weren't entirely homogenous, Italians were a large group in that neighborhood. But because there's so much more open space and arguably fewer restrictions. I mean, Italians did face prejudice. There were certain neighborhoods that they couldn't live in, couldn't buy a home in. But mostly, they didn't have to stay in the enclave. They could go farm in Burbank. They could buy, they could achieve that like white picket fence earlier. So many of the enclaves broke up, but at an earlier rate. But then you also saw like certain phenomena that we also see repeated in various parts of the country. Like, for instance, when my family first settled in Los Angeles right after World War II, they settled in Lincoln Heights, which was a large Italian enclave. But just as you saw, like in New York, the areas that were chosen for redevelopment or for the construction of the freeway or other, projects often were like, the so-called like slums or the melting pot areas that happened to be Italian neighborhoods. So there were other factors that kind of led to like the early demise of these neighborhoods. So, there's, and within them, there were many, within the neighborhoods, there were many of the same like structures as you see in New York, like the churches, the bakeries, the groceries. So, if you were to be transported back in time to Los Angeles, 1919, Little Italy, maybe aside from the climate and not as many, large buildings, it wouldn't be that different than other parts of the country, other Little Italy.
The biggest shock that I've had going to Los Angeles and having your perspective on Los Angeles is the fact that I never considered Los Angeles as having an Italian community.
Fifth largest, or sixth, depending on who you ask.
And it's autochthonous. What's the correct word for that? I don't know if indigenous is the right word, but I thought that, a lot of us, especially the East Coast people, have the preconceived notion that when the film business took off in Los Angeles, that people connected with entertainment and media created what was the Italian aspect of Los Angeles, which is completely inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think, okay, well, Frank Sinatra brought Italians to, Dean Martin and Frank Capra and those people brought Italian culture to Los Angeles, Italian American culture, or however you want to name it. That's not the case. You had, the things, the components that make up what people consider an Italian neighborhood, like the parish and the bakery and the whole nine yards. And the Italian hall, right, the social center, which is now your museum. What do you think it was that tended to overshadow the Italians in Los Angeles, where they didn't have the rightfully recognized part of the image that they had in places like Chicago or New York, or Boston or something east of the Rockies?
Well, I think it's a few things. Number one, Los Angeles is horrible at, or has been historically awful at, really presenting its own history. We often let other people speak for us. Los Angeles is said to be like one of the most photographed cities in the world, but even Angelenos are ignorant of their history. The only time we really learn local history is in the 3rd and 4th grade, unless you take it, in college. Because
I had talked to my grandmother very thoroughly in the 90s. 'Cause I've always been me, right? My grandmother who I lived with my whole life. And she said she felt she had absolutely no discrimination at all during the war.
Because she lived in a major population center.
Right. And my grandmother always said all the time was the fact that, so my grandmother's first cousin was an Italian P.O.W. My grandmother always used to talk about her first cousin was captured in North Africa in the Italian army. He was shipped to a POW camp somewhere in the West, maybe Arizona or New Mexico, I'm not sure. And he contacted whoever was in the camp and said, I have cousins in New Jersey. I have uncles. I have all these relatives. Can you ship me to New Jersey? So my grandmother's first cousin was transferred to an Italian POW camp in Belmead, New Jersey. And my grandmother's father had suffered a stroke, so he couldn't leave the house. So this Italian POW in a POW camp in the United States, an enemy, right, because we were at war, was given sign out permission. So my grandmother would sign him out. They would drive down to Belmead, sign him out of the POW camp, and he would go to Jersey City for the day.
That's actually one of the ironies that I speak of in my book, that we had, so we kind of differentiate here. So there's Italian POWs who were actually, soldiers typically captured, brought here, put in these POW camps. And then you had Italian Americans who do not have who oftentimes just they didn't become naturalized citizens, some of whom had been here the majority of their lives. They had American-born children who are forced to leave their homes. Some of them are arrested and sent to internment camps. So two different groups of people. Ironically, the Italian POWs oftentimes had more rights. They were allowed to be signed out than the Italian Americans who are interned or forced to relocate. Lots of great stories about that. There were a number of these camps in Southern California, and like you said, the Italian families, many times they were looking for husbands for their daughters. They would go and sign these guys out on Sundays, bring them home for dinner, and then take them back at the end of the day. But I think the legacy of World War II, to kind of get back to your question, was like many of us, especially on the West Coast, we learned how not to be Italian, how not to appear outwardly Italian. You saw Italian language newspapers fold and never recover after World War II, just completely shut their doors. Italian language schools. Italian. Speaking of Italian, I think nationwide decreased substantially. But many of us, we became kind of closeted Italians, and that was a generation. My father was born in 1934, so that was like the Depression and the war years. That was very much his childhood, and it shaped him throughout his life. He was always a very proud Italian American, but it was just the way the identity is expressed on the West Coast, oftentimes among those generations, is often very different. But you kind of going back to your earlier question, we're a diverse group in Los Angeles. You have the Italian Americans who have 200 years of history in the region. You have those who are immigrating from Italy now, who are part of the brain drain, and you have everything in between. You've got like the post-World War II immigration, the 1960s immigration, and they're all pretty different. And a lot of times they don't necessarily feel like they have much in common. I don't know if that's pretty common here.
I think the geography plays part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said to me, and I don't know, like from like a New York perspective, right? There's like a very much here.
Mm-hmm.
And Los Angeles is so spread out. I don't know if that resonates with you, but the impression I always get in Los Angeles is this place is kind of like
it's spread out.
Spread out, and you don't know. It's kind of like it's built like a highway suburban America in my perception, right? So if we're here in Manhattan right now. What's like 1614? The Dutch are here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like pretty early on. But I think the 1614 drop retreat is in Newark, right? Or 1624. But we're here a long time now, right? So if America is going to be about to be 250 years old, New York is now well over 400.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're starting to get a deep history. Now Los Angeles does have a deep history as far as 1790, but it's already younger than the United States.
Yes.
So and the geographic. So there's, I mean, like where your museum is, where
mm-hmm.
I've been. Yes, that's the original Los Angeles.
Yes.
But it's just so there's.
Yes, and then you
and
also
not to use sprawl as
there is
colloquial,
sprawl.
but
There's sprawl, and then you also you can do a population comparison of Los Angeles in 1920. It becomes this modern city. It's really not until 1920 that our population starts to boom because we secure more water. Los Angeles is all about water. If you ever saw the film Chinatown, you compare the population of New York in 1920, which I don't know what it was, but probably in the tens.
Exponentially larger.
So I think for many years, Los Angeles in the West was kind of seen as this remote. It still is, this cultural backwater. And many of my New York friends, present company excluded, they think it's somehow it's a shorter trip for me to come out here than for them to, it's why come to Los Angeles?
That is true.
It is.
Why do we have that? But I think that's a very New York centric attitude.
Yes,
because this is the center of the world.
The world exists in New York.
So why am I going to? Yeah, the world exists in New York. So why am I going to go see you for when you'd be so much better off coming to see me?
Well, a lot of time
that is a New York. I agree. That's very much a New York attitude.
Yeah.
But let me ask you. The impression that I've gotten,
mm-hmm.
especially from New York, from California-based listeners, so the war years, you seem to have gotten more prejudice.
Yeah.
but it doesn't seem. It seems almost in a sense you were able to integrate. There wasn't as much of a distinctness in ethnicity in California as there was here.
Yeah, and again, like, there's lots of things that come into play, with that. So Italians are, a small population compared to the greater population of Los Angeles. There's other groups that kind of absorb more of like the ethnic animosity. If you look at Italians, like if there's like the meter of like white to black, Italians are kind of somewhere here. Certainly in a place like Los Angeles, you see like Asians, and in the later years, like Latino populations kind of being seen as more of like the others than Italians. Italians are arguably like, more white than others. But at the same time, during those war years, because they are a smaller group, and I think the nation was looking for a scapegoat. They found one in the Japanese community. There's a whole, we could talk about that as well. Roosevelt knew that he could not carry out this mass incarceration of Italian Americans nationwide. It would, in a place like New York, it would have devastated the economy. But in California, they started, of course, like with the Japanese, and the plan was to, at one time, to relocate both Italians and Italian Americans. But in the end, it was really only the Italian aliens.
Did you ever hear what Orson Welles said about that?
No, tell me.
Orson Welles contended before his death that he had had a meeting with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt had told him that he had put the Japanese in camps because he was afraid of violence against the Japanese, and that he felt that if he used the excuse of internment, that if something happened, there was some atrocity, where there were Americans in California who wanted to take revenge on Japanese Americans, if he could have them protected in camps, he could prevent that. I was blown away by that. I mean, I don't know how much conclusive evidence there is to back it up, but Orson Welles in print came out and said that it was Roosevelt's felt that if he came out and said, I'm concerned about the safety of Japanese Americans, it would have gotten him in a lot of trouble, and that was the avenue that he used to prevent if anything had gone wrong, in the sense that, something had happened and an incident had occurred as a retaliation for something that would happen with the American soldiers during the war. But I think that, so we have a book here that talks a lot about the past, like the past of the mosaic of Italians in California.
Or Los Angeles.
Oh, Los Angeles. But let me ask you one question before we move on to the current situation and the future situation. Do you feel that Northern Italians play more of a role in Los Angeles than they do in other parts of the country? I've taken that impression, like being in California, the northern part of the state especially, but throughout the state, there seems to be a greater presence of Northern Italians, and they seem to be a little bit more engaged with Southern Italians than they were here on the East Coast.
Yes and no. So, like in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, that early immigration of Italians, that first wave was often Northern Italians. Similar to San Francisco, in Los Angeles, there was a number of Genovese, Ticinese, Piemontese. They oftentimes, like especially the Piemontese community, was integral in really helping make the wine industry what it is. Many people think of Napa in Northern California as, the center of winemaking, but before Prohibition, Los Angeles was actually the winemaking capital of the state. And so you see Northern Italians playing a significant role and becoming economically, very, very successful, lots of upward mobility. But I would say numerically, the majority from, again, from 1900 or even earlier onward are Southern Italian. And I would say for many years, probably until recently, until the more recent immigrations, I would say 80s onward, is still predominantly Southern Italian. And, many of our traditions, you look at our feasts, those are all Southern Italian.
Now, we've had the discussion between ourselves previously how Los Angeles is like the second or third stop for a lot of Italians. So for your family, it's like the third stop. Am I correct?
So my Sicilian side, my grandmother's side came in through New Orleans. They cut sugar, went to Colorado where there's a steel industry, and stayed there until coming out to California in the 40s. My grandfather's side came in through Canada, went to Pittsburgh, worked in the steel industry, and went to Colorado, then to California. My mother's side, my mother came here, settled in Boston, and met my father on vacation in California. So yeah, I guess it's like the third stop.
What would you say? Because especially if you want to talk about St. Peter's, right? So you have there were multiple Italian parishes.
Two that were really Italian parishes, but then there are others that had like predominantly Italian congregations, like Sacred Heart in Lincoln Heights. Even though it was an Italian parish for years, it was, they had masses in Italian. And
But St. Peter's was your actual
Italian national parish,
de facto
yeah.
Italian national parish. One of the things that impressed me about Los Angeles that I think a lot of people don't know is the amount of processions that came out of St. Peter's.
Yeah, we used to have more.
What towns are represented there?
Gosh, okay, so at St. Peter's, it's from like the 1960s onward, it's been largely a Barese parish. There's this kind of fascinating chain migration from little villages in like the Bari area, like Adelphia, Motrone. And so probably about like at least 4 or 5 processions or saints are from those little towns. But we also in Los Angeles have one of the largest Tavola de San Giuseppe or St. Joseph tables in the region. And that, of course, began as like a Sicilian society. So I would say like it's primarily Barese and Sicilian that are best represented among our feast days.
How much of that? So there's a lot of like you had a lot of the stuff that I think we found in other parts of America, like more the Midwestern states, like the Queen of the Feast and that sort of thing. How much of that stuff has held on? What did you have that were those particular truly Italian American hyphenated traditions, right?
In Los Angeles.
How many of them would you say kind of hung on or exist in Los Angeles?
Gosh, that's a good question. I mean, sadly, they're disappearing like a lot of places. I often say like we're 20. I see the future. Like
That's
we're 20.
exactly. Well, should we jump to that right now?
Oh boy, sure.
Let it go.
I mean,
So that what you're really hearing now is our own conversation.
Yes,
So
so-
we're taking our personal conversations
As we
and we're
often do.
actually recording them
Yeah.
for posterity. So that being said, go ahead.
So I started really working in the Italian American community in the 90s. So that's like 30 years ago, right? And when I first started, I was part of an Italian umbrella organization that's now defunct called Federated Italo-Americans. And it was like this idea that like this one group speaks for the many, like at that time, like 75 Italian American organizations in Los Angeles. So in the 90s, there were still 75 Italian American organizations, at least on paper.
That's a big number.
A big number.
That's one of the numbers that shocked me because, again, with the New York mentality of, well, this is the center of the universe and there's like 5 Italians out in Los Angeles.
More than that.
And it's like, Frank and Dino.
Yeah.
Once I heard 75 organizations, that really blew my mind.
Yeah, and I mean, there were even more than that weren't part of this umbrella group. Again, and some of them, are completely gone from, history. But anyway, so that number has continued to shrink, unfortunately. And oftentimes, as we see repeated in various parts of the country, many times like the leadership, these guys, and I say guys because they're often men, like they don't believe in passing the torch. And it's like, it's going to die with me. And it has.
That is the trademark of Italian organizations. The president who's there forever with the mandate of it dies with me.
Yeah, or like they get into an argument with one of the members, and now you have 2 organizations. Like 2 in Los Angeles, we had 2 Sicilian organizations at one time, and they're both gone. Because their membership is old or has passed on. So I say oftentimes that like I'm living the future of Italian American Los Angeles. We're 20 years ahead in terms of like ethnic identification, and
I think that's the most important. If I felt that the beauty of your book, the excellence of your book, justified an episode just on the book while you were here in town. And I know that John would have loved to have been here because, no, he is your greatest fan after me.
Well, I miss you, John.
But that being said, I think that we justify on your second trip out really the fact that you have said time and time again that you are 20 years ahead of us, the rest of America. And I think that is completely true.
Yeah, so it's like a warning, get it together, find a way to work out your differences, make your resources count because, maybe things are going to change, but it's challenging.
I think by talking to you, I found that so to be in a world that's going to be flatter and flatter in the sense that the internet has changed everything, right? We're old enough to understand the world before and after the internet, right? So now we're really becoming a globalized society. So differences are more now of a choice than just being de facto.
Mm.
And one of the things that I've noticed over time is that ethnicity has given way to race.
Yes.
So when you described, and I didn't interrupt you, but when you described Italians as being somewhere halfway between white and black, right? Mm-hmm. That's a really modern post-2000 concept. Because
being like a gray ethnicity, like white ethnics.
I think that California was looking at things in terms of race, when New York was still looking at things in terms of ethnicity.
Yeah, and I think like the ethnic hierarchy. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, I lived in a part of Los Angeles that was very diverse. My Catholic elementary school, my class of 31, we had 23 different countries represented, if you will, like ethnicities, I guess. Though many of us were born in the United States, the majority of us, I would say. But as an Italian American, I wasn't considered white in the same way that like the German, Irish, those kind of kids. But I wasn't considered a minority, like in the same way like the Filipinos or the Latin American kids. So I didn't really belong anywhere. That's the story of my life, right?
Yeah, but that whole prism is a prism of race as compared to ethnicity.
Yeah.
I don't think that was it's on the radar screens now because that's the last 10 years that's been the prism of everything.
Yeah, and gender.
I feel like that. But I mean, if you take gender is gender, right?
Yeah,
that's a whole different animal than ethnicity.
Though I guess I think that like now you look at this generation and they're more consumed with gender than gender identity than race. I feel like that's
if you ask a kid today, mm-hmm. what are you? Mm-hmm. Where a Gen Xer in the 90s would say an ethnicity. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm Polish.
Yeah.
That has now become I'm white.
Yeah.
But race doesn't have with it the culture of an ethnicity.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So I think as we've redefined people's identity in terms of race, especially for the younger kids, over ethnicity, why am I going to join a group that binds me on ethnicity when they don't see that as a defining characteristic of identity? If kids don't identify as Italian American, it's game over. And I think that you have brought that to our attention. I think that the one thing you have, it's like I found as I go, Middle America has more of a sense, and I say this in one sense, I feel it's more like 1980 in the perception, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel you're more like 2050, right? And we're
God
here somewhere in the middle.
That's why I love being in New York, honestly, because I've longed for this my whole life. Like there's a certain, I don't know, affinity, there's a certain belonging. And certainly like, if I want to go back in time when there was more of that identification, when you could still, be surrounded by Italian-owned businesses and, you're walking down the street and you run into, that's why one of the reasons I'm here, why I come here. And
you do like it here.
Oh, I love it. I mean, if I could be here, there's this one great article in the LA Times that I found about an Italian American who had become very prominent in like the banking industry, and it read something like, so and so, like he represents the finest of his race. He's a Northern Italian, not to be confused with all these like swarthy Southern Italians who are coming here now. I think it's not.
Does that help us?
I mean,
this being stigmatized help you being a tribe?
I think it depends on the era. I mean, I think during like the 40s, the reaction was more of like, you internalize. There was almost a sense of shame. Like, I don't think you maybe experienced that so much out here, but among like the generation that I grew up with, the people who would be like 100, in their 80s or 90s, or they would be over 100 now. The Italianness was something that like they kept in their heart. They never lost that, but outwardly, they often had to appear less Italian. It was like to prove their Americanness, and now that I think about it, maybe that is something that is more uniquely Los Angeles, or places where Italians were not necessarily the majority. So maybe it's like the majority factor that you guys had in places like New York.
I listened to this rabbi on Instagram. Instagram gets you all these interesting, and I don't know what like Hasidic. There's all different. Orthodox Judaism has all different branches. I don't know what category this guy fits in. I think he might be Shabbat. I'm not sure, but he made a comment one time that blew my mind. He said, to be a good Jew, you have to live around other Jews. Not being a good Jew in the sense of a good or bad person, but it's easiest to practice Judaism when everyone around you is Jewish, right? And he goes into the fact you got to walk to the synagogue, so you have to live around other Jews. And the mikvah for the women, all this other stuff, and like kosher butchers and stuff like that. And I thought to myself, if I looked at the Italian Americans around the country, I have found that the most determining factor of where they fall in practice, I'll say in orthodoxy, in being kosher Italians, is how surrounded they are by other Italians. And that's why I think New Jersey was so strong, because I think New Jersey had, like, in the last census, was like 2 million Italian Americans out of a 9 million population. I know someone's going to come back and argue that, but it was something like that. And, why did we wind up with who we were? Because from the end of the Civil War, basically, the late 1860s, when the Genovese started to come and started cigar rollers in Jersey City and Hoboken, from them up until really now, and we've had a trickle. If people have a way to get to America from a relative and a way to claim American residency, citizenship, green card, they use it, right? So we've had consistent immigration and really heavy immigration to the 70s. So you could have someone here whose family came to America in the 1870s, but they're still going to be living around people who speak broken English because they came from Italy 20 years ago, and they're going to have all the stuff that comes from someone freshly removed from Italy and planted in the United States. But what I find is that I think that the Italian Americans are becoming now, correct me if I'm wrong, a smaller part of the percentage in California,
or they're just
Los Angeles,
they're kind of how can I say this? They're losing some of those identifying qualities. Like, I remember when I was in the 80s. My grandfather lived in Hollywood at that time. And Hollywood had a fairly large Italian American population where you could still go, walk to the grocery or the deli or the bakery, and there would be, I remember there was this one woman, Maria Teresa, who my grandfather was a widow already at that time, and she was, he was a widower, she was a widow, and she dressed in the widow's black, and there were a lot of more of those remnants than you see now. And so it's still there, but maybe like that widow, she no longer wears the black clothing. She's not as identifiable as.
And someone's gonna go bananas.
Because
somebody's gonna annoy me. Someone's gonna go bananas. You mentioned the widow in the black dress, and because they're gonna say that you're spinning it, and that's not, especially the Italians in Italy.
How so, though?
Because they're gonna go nuts if that doesn't represent the.
Look,
it's like the same way as wearing, like if you ever watch the pictures of the 1950s of old women in the 50s. So a woman who's born about 1870, right? In the 1950s, she's in her 80s, and she's wearing a dress down to her ankles because she never wore a dress above her calf, because her whole life, in her old young days, people wore dress down to their ankles, right? So some Italian is going to flip out.
Well, God bless them. God bless them for being so sensitive. But, Italian America is a big tent. And when you study the Italians in LA or the Italians in Omaha or Colorado or wherever, Louisiana, you realize like there are many different ways that we express our identity, that you have
to express an identity. Like Let me ask you a question. What would you say the other dominant minority ethnicities are in Los Angeles? Persians, Iranians?
Huge. I mean, remember, we're like New York. I mean, we are home to the largest populations of so many groups outside of their native, like Armenians, Persians. So we have Salvadorians. I mean, you name it. Los Angeles is.
Let's take Persians and Armenians.
Okay.
Now, we'll say Persians all hightailed out of Iran in 1979, right? A lot of people left. The same way that a lot of Cubans got out of Cuba when Castro came in, and they wound up in Miami, and they wound up in the New York metro area, places like Union City, New Jersey. But if you take Miami has had consistent waves of immigration from Cuba, right? So there's plenty of people who are freshly from Cuba walking around Miami. So that helps to strengthen the community because you have continuous immigration, the way that New Jersey had with Italians. And the big thrust of Cuban immigration to Miami probably comes in the 1960s, right? So really, 60 years in almost now, it doesn't have the kind of span of time that Italian Americans do. Do you think, though, that the Persians and the Armenians, who you would say have strong communities now,
Oh, yeah.
are they going to have strong communities 40 or 50 years from now?
Well, 40 or 50 years from now, I mean, gosh, it's anybody's guess, but I'll like speak to the Armenian community. I live among a large Armenian community, and you kind of see the same phenomenon in that there's like the 1800s immigration, like the William Saroyan immigration of Armenians to California. And then there's been, this continued immigration of Armenians. And remember, Armenians come from so many different places in addition to Armenia, right? There's Persian Armenians, Greek Armenians, Russian Armenians,
Syrian
Armenians. And so we have all those different all those different like subsets, if you will, of Armenians reflected in Los Angeles. And I often like observe them. And it's almost like I see them as like, where the Italians were in like maybe the 50s, 60s, Los Angeles. Their kids still go to Armenian school on the weekend. They hang out with other Armenians. They celebrate Armenian Christmas in addition to the Western Christmas. They're very closely knit. It's hard to predict 40 years, but and then if I think it also depends on whether the immigration is continuous.
I often think the Italian Canadians. We have a lot of Italian Canadian listeners. I dare to say we have more Italian Australian listeners. I know you were still on our sister podcast, the Italian Australian podcast. I have to listen to.
Love you guys.
But we're often schooled by the Italian Canadians that we're not really Italian enough, that they're the true Italians. Because, and that's a whole other story about the concept in Canada, which I think was more about keeping Quebec in the family, about that Canada was a nation of nations. But also, Canada had some Italian immigration to like the St. Catharines area,
I have cousins
parts
in
of
Canada,
Ontario that were there in the 1900s, 1920s. But their big immigration was because of America had very restricting laws after World War II. So a lot of people in the south of Italy, even though they had relatives in the U.S., wound up going to Canada and Australia, which was to Canada and Australia's benefit and America's loss.
From the 1920s really on.
20s, but the real thrust, of Italo-Canadians are people who came in the 50s and 60s. And I was saying the same thing for Australia. So a lot of Italian Canadians, I think, in about 10 or 20 years, are going to get this shock value that they're going to see. I think that their identity is going to dissipate. And this is not an before I got 5,000 Canadians sending me whacked out emails. Save yourself the time because I don't even check email, right? But I think they're going to have a quicker integration because they had less of a stigmatization. So I think that they felt they were more easily accepted into Canada. I feel the strength of Italian Americans on the East Coast was between the Irish and the WASPs, you're not really... The Irish are embarrassed. We have the same religion, and you carry on like that. And the Irish want to be in control because they get the institutions that they take over from the WASPs. The WASPs want nothing to do with these people. So Italians being stigmatized, I think that identity of being other, or you're probably in the mafia, you probably, rub your body down with olive oil, you smell garlic. That helped us keep an identity, right? I think Canada and Australia not having that to the same extent, having that prejudice helps make you into a tribe. I think that when the immigrant generation dies out in Canada, it's going to happen in Australia, it's going to happen like it did everywhere else. and you're not going to be living around people who speak broken English and don't know how to write something in English, or what does that mean in English. Once the immigration generation is dead, then we're going to see where Canada and Australia are, right? But I think there's a chance they're going to integrate even faster. But Canada, us, Australia, how do we keep a defined ethnicity? Because at least Jews have it's a religion, and
in addition to a culture.
and it's a culture, but there's different cultures, right? You
Yes.
have a Sephardic culture, an Ashkenazi culture, and there's all different subsets. But this, you could say the north of Italy, if you want to take the Sephardic Ashkenazi thing as a northern southern Italian thing, but they've coalesced into a nation because they've had a rough road, and they have the idea of continuity. I think the Armenians have that going for them. But with the Armenians, is that going to last in 4 or 5 generations?
That's a good question. I mean, the world seems like it's moving so much faster than ever now. And so I wish I had that crystal ball. But I mean, what I see of the Armenian parents in Los Angeles is they make sure that their kids know where they come from. They still speak the language. It's just this incredibly vibrant community. And it's.
I think the bellwether is the Greeks, and I don't think any of these are going to last. And not last in the sense that when the Normans got to Ireland, right, during the Norman conquest in the 10th century, within 3 generations, they were integrated, right? So when the Danes conquered Ireland, not conquered, but they were marauding all the time. Within 3 generations, they were intermarried, right? So you had mixed populations because, especially when you have the same religion. So now if you want to say American religion is secularism, right? So we don't have the same situation as, well, you're a Presbyterian, you're a Catholic, you can't get married. So now whenever people getting married in a barn with the justice of the peace, where that stuff is not an impediment anymore. So in a secular America, the religion doesn't matter. Or if you go back to the Irish, right, when the Danes converted to Christianity and the Normans converted to Christianity, the Vikings, it was easier to integrate because you had the same religion in common. With the Greeks, right, Greeks are encouraged to marry Greeks the way that Armenians are encouraged to marry Armenians. And if Greeks marry out, they're a lot like we used to be, where if you're not Greek and you're gonna marry me, you have to become Orthodox and we have to raise our kids Orthodox. But a lot of that, I think, is because you have Gen X kids whose parents are Greek off the boat, right? So they're first generation Greek Americans. There's even in New York and other parts of the country, Chicago especially, there's 3rd or 4th generation Greek Americans, but the real Greek immigration to the U.S. comes in the post-war era. When they are 3, 4 generations Greek American, are they going to be saying, my kid's got to marry Orthodox, they got to marry Greek Orthodox? Are 2 American-born Greek parents, 2 American-born Greek American kids, when they have their kids, are they only going to speak Greek to each other because they don't want the kids to understand? Where is it going to be 3 or 4 generations?
Yeah, I mean, I think just, probably looking at ethnicity and that sort of thing being less of a defining factor, just, that's my anticipation. But who knows? I mean, I think we're also seeing the pendulum swinging in the other direction. I look at, Damien, my son's generation. My son is 30.
We didn't talk about Damien. Damien deserves his own episode.
I know.
Nikki, we're going to get 2 episodes out of this. Let's keep going. John's not here. I can do whatever I want to do. Bye, John. Where is John? He's far away. He's on another continent. Freedom.
Yeah, I mean,
Drink it in.
You see, Damien's generation.
Now, Damien's 30.
30. He'll be 31 the end of this month.
That's what I was going to say. So Damien is Damien Gen Z? Is he millennial?
He's
a young millennial, probably.
Yeah, right. Between the two. But,
so what do you see as his mom? With his generation? Because again, what makes Damien interesting is Damien's growing up in
Los
the
Angeles.
petri dish that's Los Angeles.
Yeah, I mean, Damien's kind of an interesting. He's interesting on a lot of levels, but he's more conservative than a lot of his peers, certainly, and I can't predict who he's going to marry or what. We have this conversation my advice as his mother is, when you're looking at marrying at this age, you're really choosing who you're going to co-parent with, who's going to be the,
And your son is 100% Italian.
yes, that's like kind of like another interesting, he's Italian on both sides. He's probably, many of his friends are multi-ethnic, multiracial, and it's, as you said, it's just going to kind of continue from there.
But then if we take the kids, the IAFL kids, they have made, I think the one game changer for me, at least in an intellectual sense, is that we may not get all the kids, but we're definitely going to get some of the kids.
Yes.
Because whole IAFL program, which you've been a part of, that we've run, there are kids with fractional representation of being Italian, who even if they didn't, what really fascinates me is even if they didn't grow up with it, want to reconnect to something that they only really have a license to because of blood. Of DNA, right? So they didn't grow up with so they weren't jarring tomatoes. Their parents weren't jarring tomatoes. Their grandmothers weren't jarring tomatoes, but they wanted jarred tomatoes.
And and maybe because we're realizing that everything else is nonsense, and it's all about jarring tomatoes and jarring tomatoes, making sausage. I mean, all this other stuff hopefully is just passing fancies, and we're going to realize that there is no substitution for human interaction. That stop eating all the processed food crap and.
You can get really good quality jarred tomatoes, organic from Italy.
Yeah, of course you can.
Right? So
Of course
jarring
you can.
tomatoes is a lot of work.
Yeah, and you
right?
can get really great sopressata and everything, but you can
people
also
are choosing
yes
to jar tomatoes, right? So if you take it before the war, right? You couldn't. I remember my grandma talking because we had an Italian. I come from Italian American groceries on both sides, fruit and vegetable business on both sides, and my grandmother said to me, because I was the kid that tortured her daily with questions, and she said to me, I guess maybe it was after the war. They stopped jarring tomatoes. Number one, my grandmother was paranoid about jarring tomatoes, and that you guys have heard that.
because of botulism.
Yeah, because she knew a family that got wiped out. But
Yeah.
my grandmother talked about when the cans, how convenient it was having the store and just going downstairs to the store and just taking a can of tomatoes off the shelf, right? How liberating that was in the fact that you didn't have to worry about, I didn't jar enough of tomatoes. How convenient that became, right? So now that we're now on 70 years of convenient jarred tomatoes. And we have to do it anymore. But the reason I bring it up is that Instagram, I now found in August, is just full of pictures, videos. Mike Giordano, the king of jarring tomatoes, right? And he's a story to himself. And a guy who chose to have a tomato jarring tradition with his kids because he wants them to grow up with that, right?
Well, nostalgia eases the pain of the present. And if you look around and agree with everything that's going on right now, I think, escapism, how not? Right?
Yeah, but if you didn't grow up with it, is it nostalgia when it was never yours?
Well, okay. Maybe, it could be, or it could just be like you elect, these other things. I did not grow up making cucirati. I grew up eating them. My cousin, who's 93, so she's my dad's cousin, she was the cucirati maker. I adopted, I started making this cookie because, it was like the cookie of my family for generations. There was just like that pause. That tradition was interrupted, I think in part because my grandmother only had boys. So it was, her recipes were passed on to my father passed them on to me. That was one cookie that we didn't make. And so, but it's
you make them on. Let's expose you to the audience out there. You make them on a commercial scale now.
Well, not commercial, just
I've
massive.
But you put them on your pictures on every. You're on multiple social media. You're active. Was it 890?
900. I think. 80.
So you made 900 cucirati. Let's expose you for who you really are. 900. That's a lot of cookies.
That's a lot of cookies.
That's
because
cookies.
there's a lot of people that
But you ship them out all over the country.
all over the country.
If you could charge for these.
No.
But you're almost there.
That would
900 is a lot of cookies.
A lot of cookies.
How many pounds do you think that is?
Well, I can tell you. It's interesting because it's like close to 20 pounds of ground fruit and nuts, but it's only 5 pounds of flour. So, if you think about that ratio-wise.
That's only one bag of flour?
Yeah, only 5 pounds of, 10 pounds of flour. 10 pounds of flour.
2 bags?
2 bags.
Who grinds all those cookies?
I do.
You grind all, but you have a hand grinder.
No. I use a food processor.
I was going to say.
No. This is one of those things. It's like when I get into the oh my gosh, I'm doing this, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I realize it's like, my grandmother and great grandmother, they probably, they were probably shelling all those nuts on their own.
Yes.
I
I
mean,
tried shelling nuts one year.
yeah.
And I don't, not for, just for this Christmas stuff. I was like, this is a lot of work.
you know?
And then you got to go pick the shell out.
Yeah.
For those out there in podcast land who don't know what a cucciadati is, it's a Sicilian Christmas cookie.
Yeah, Christmas or like any special occasion. We also make them for the Feast of San Giuseppe, but in my family, they were traditionally Christmas time. And I often describe them as like the history of Sicily contained in a cookie, because if you look at the various ingredients, like they speak to the legacy of all the different cultures that influenced Sicily over the millennia. But I make them with a mixture of dried fruits, so like primarily fig, but dates, raisins, other stuff.
And you grind them all together.
I grind it all together.
It had to be the Arabs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you think of what Sicily was controlled by Arabs for 400 years?
Yeah, but it's like, so the figs came from the Greeks, right? The dates came from the Arabs. Raisins, grapes have been grown in Italy, that area for a long time. I use a combination of nuts. So like probably traditionally the recipe would have been like walnuts and almonds. That, like almonds are more traditionally Sicilian, but I use hazelnuts as well.
Now you talk about reinvigorating this because you didn't have this. You got the cookies growing.
I like, for me, they were always my favorite cookie, and I several years back, I'm like, all right, I'm gonna, I found my grandmother's recipe that came from her mother, and I said, all right, and I realized that my cousin was using that same recipe. So I kind of like, I think like guided by an invisible hand, I've kind of continued to adapt this, and you kind of cook by emotion, by feeling, by intuition.
Were you looking for the recipe, or
yeah, I
was it always there? Did you have a eureka moment? You opened up a book and it was in there?
Yeah, so my dad passed on a lot of recipes to me, but then going through some of his papers, I found others, including the recipe for like what were described as Sicilian fig cookies or cucciolati, and that was like, okay, and it was said on the top like Vita's recipe, and Vita is my great grandmother. So it was just one of those like, all right, I need to do these.
Was your father's cousin still alive?
Yeah, she's still alive, and her name is also Vita.
Did she coach you in the cookie
No,
production?
and it's funny because I just sent her a box, and she called me, and we were discussing all the intricacies because she's made them her whole life as well, and she's, like I said, she's 90. I think she's 95 now. God bless her. And she said, I didn't make them this year, so I'm having your cucciolati, and thank you, but. We were discussing like some of the nuances, like, well, why are yours, a little softer than mine, and that sort of thing.
Was your father alive when you took up the cucciolati?
No,
making
my father. So it was a very special moment because I was going through some of his things and I found this recipe, and it was my it's my great grandmother's recipe. So it was like, this is my sign.
This is freeing, isn't it?
Oh
this is a.
Who else can I have this conversation with?
What do we call this? A freestyle? Nikki, what are we going to call this episode? Let's talk about whatever we feel like.
If I could just say, like, these cookies, I've come to realize like are magical because when I send them out, it really, and this is okay. It's just more free flowing stuff. Like, you get to a certain point in life where. Being a parent, like when my son was younger, you're doing the holidays, you're seeing like all the magic of the holidays through their eyes. And then as I've gotten older, I've become more like consumed with like the ritual because I feel like the ritual has been removed a bit.
Define ritual.
Well, okay. I grew up, my life as a kid really centered around like our parish. That was like our social life. I went to Catholic school. All my friends were.
We were the last ones to have that.
And so, like, really, it was the ecclesiastic calendar that was a big, shaped a lot of my life, like all the traditions that are associated with these. Yeah. And then, you become an adult, life becomes much more secular. My son is older now.
And the country changed.
Yeah, the country changed. And, I just found myself, like, longing for these more... I don't know, I guess you could say like traditions in short. So, and I think like these cookies, these cucciolati, I think also kind of help me take and understand the pulse of the other people as well, because the comment I receive is like, I haven't had these cookies since, like this is a cookie that's like almost anachronistic. People don't make them anymore because they're labor intensive, they're expensive. But they bring people back. And if that's not like the greatest gift that you can give somebody this time of year.
How many boxes do you send out?
This year was about 100.
Do people get whacked off of your list?
Yes.
Do they really?
Yes.
Is that the kiss of death?
Well,
Is that the Marianna Gatto kiss of death? Is that the not to go to a Godfather reference, but is that the three fishes?
Okay, so I'm not a particular like a punitive person. There are some people like, okay, so the list overall every year grows. Okay, sometimes it shrinks because a person has passed on, but there are a few people like there's this one guy who's like, can you make me a gluten-free version? And I'm like, no, I cannot.
He got canned.
He got canned,
And that's the reason. All right, so
and like, unless you're a billionaire, like, and you don't say thank you, like, I mean, I don't expect, this huge acknowledgement, but there's a few people that I'm like, nah, maybe you just don't like these. So it's like, all right.
if someone's been canned off your list, what should they be thinking right now? Will they know that they've committed sins?
This is
have them excommunicate. Do you have a ceremony?
No, this is a
like
very.
When they used to break the candle. When you have the list of the damned, right?
It's more
of
like
read them off? But you're a woman who's into ceremony and tradition. You should get together with your son and have a list of the damned.
No, well,
those who were removed. You could have a moment of silence for those who passed, right? This guy is not with us anymore. That one, you could have a moment of silence.
Yeah.
And then you could have the list of the damned. And you could do a recitation of the sins of why they're damned. Do you rehabilitate people once they're off?
You can get put back on, the list. I mean, and remember, like, a lot of these folks are also like, the majority of the people who I make these for are somehow connected to the museum. There's a lot of personal folks on the list, family members, friends and stuff, but like, there are people who have usually some way like supported the museum throughout the year. And again, like, so yeah, there's not a really damnation process.
This is so much fun. I don't have John to rein me in. I could go on for days. We could just keep talking. Nikki, should we get people off the street and just bring them in? Can we do a 3-hour? I think we're going to do a 3-hour podcast episode. So I want to say it's great to now I have my own podcast and that I'm free and I'm liberated.
Can we tell people where to get the book?
Oh, I almost forgot. I was going to do a whole other one. Now listen. We have to tape. We have more stuff to do today, so we have to go. If not, this would have been my favorite 3-hour podcast. Freedom.
Oh.
Freedom. But John was very nice. We have my cue card here, what to say. This is where, listen, see the book? See the book? I'm not just saying it because she's my friend. I'm not saying it because she's on the podcast. This is an absolutely fantastic book. Now, you got to have a well-stocked library in the sense that even though you're not from Los Angeles, I think it's so well done and it's so interesting, and I think it's an easy read.
And if I may just interject one thing, like one of the things about this book is like, Los Angeles was, as we kind of said earlier, was like the terminus. It was often people's like final destination. And so, they might have started in Patterson or in Boston or in Philly. So there's like lots of there's lots of connections to other parts of the country. And, whether you're interested in Los Angeles or Italian Americans, I think, hopefully you'll find this book interesting and it will contribute to your knowledge of our people.
And another important thing is, this is an expensive book to publish.
Yeah.
If you want to see these books come out, you have to take out your wallet and put your money where your heart is. Because if we don't go and support people like Cavalieri Gatto and her publishing enterprise, they're not going to be able to afford to do this, because this is basically self-published. Am I correct?
No, it's Trinacria Press is my publisher. And so it's kind of like the newer model. Like, I wanted this book to be a certain way. And so I invested in it, in the design and the layout and the publishing, because I didn't want this to be your typical history book that. But
it's a financial sacrifice you had to make.
Yeah, absolutely. There's an investment.
So let's go out and make that investment pay off. And you have to go out, open up your wallet, get out your pocketbook, get out the card, Don't buy 1 copy, 2 copy, 3 copies. Buy 10 copies. And if you don't have that many people to gift one to, gift one to your local library. You want to make a statement? Go to the library and say, I want to gift this book to the library. Go to your local high school. I want to gift this to the high school library. Go to your local university and college. I want to gift this to the university or the college's library. That's how you make a difference. But your whole life has been about making a difference. And I want to thank you so much for coming on. I don't know how to close the show because, John, I only got the opening cue card.
Well, you can get it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
Amazon, go ahead.
And if you want a signed copy, you can visit my website, which is mariannagatto.com.
So I want to thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here.
We miss John.
You know how much I love you guys.
I know you love this guy. The other guy's not here. But I'm sure that...
we'll make up for it, right?
We'll make up for it. So thank you, John. You gave us a beautiful episode today. Hope you're enjoying your vacation with your beautiful family. Thank you very much for watching. I don't know what I'm supposed to say because he didn't leave me a note on that one.
Ciao for now.
What was he saying?
Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next week.
Oh, Nikki just told me. I'm supposed to say thanks, everyone, for listening. And we'll see you next week. And we'll see you next week.
Is there a kazoo now?
I don't know. I got the kazoo. I only want my American kazoo. Well, that's another kazoo. Maybe we'll have more. This is the Freedom. This is the Fidel Castro episode. It'll come in. There's been a coup.
That you're born in Italy. If you want your life to be great, see that you're born in Italiano and your life will be great. See that you're born in Italiano and